There's a war that happens quietly, not with fists or shouting matches, but with energy, with presence, with the unspoken. On one side, there's the narcissist, the one who commands attention, draws others in with charm, and seems to hold all the power in the room. And on the other, the empath, the one who feels everything deeply, who often doubts themselves, who's been told they're too sensitive, too soft, too much. From the outside, it looks like the narcissist always wins. They dominate, manipulate, control. They know how to twist words, how to perform just enough to keep you hooked. Meanwhile, the empath often walks away questioning everything. Was it me? Did I overreact? Am I the problem? But what if the entire dynamic was misunderstood? What if the empath, the one who seems emotionally fragile, is actually the one holding the mirror that the narcissist cannot bear to look into? Carl Jung once said that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life, and no one reflects that more painfully, more powerfully, than an emotionally intelligent empath in the presence of a narcissist. Because the empath doesn't just feel the room they read it. They see beneath words, beneath gestures. And over time, they begin to notice the gaps in the story the narcissist tells, the inconsistencies, the manipulations, the cracks in the illusion. The empath, when awakened, is not soft. They are seismic, because they possess something the narcissist cannot fabricate: authenticity, truth, emotional depth that cannot be faked or stolen. And once the empath begins to trust what they sense, once they stop shrinking to accommodate the narcissist's ego, everything changes. The illusion starts to crumble, the power dynamic reverses. And the person who once questioned their worth becomes the very person the narcissist fears most. Because when someone sees you without falling for your act, when someone recognizes the shadow you refuse to face, they become dangerous, not because they attack, but because they see. And in a world built on masks and performance, being seen for who you really are is the most terrifying thing there is. So no, the empath is not weak. They're just quiet. And that silence, that stillness, that's where the real power lives. To understand why the empath threatens the narcissist so deeply, we have to understand what the narcissist truly is: not the version they present to the world, but what lies beneath the mask. At the core of every narcissist is a false self, a carefully constructed identity designed to protect them from their deepest wound, the belief that they are inherently unlovable. But instead of confronting that pain, they build an illusion, a persona. Jung warned us about this. He said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." And for the narcissist, that persona isn't just a mask, it's a lifeline. They don't wear it occasionally, they live inside it. Their entire identity depends on external validation. They must be admired, praised, obeyed. Anything less, and the illusion starts to tremble. But here's the catch: because it's all a performance, it constantly needs an audience. They need someone to believe in the image, to applaud the act, and that's where the empath often enters the scene. Empaths, with their sensitivity and natural compassion, are easy to hook. They want to believe in people. They want to understand, to help, to heal. So when a narcissist walks in, wearing charm like a second skin, the empath leans in, not because they're naive, but because they feel the pain behind the mask, even if they can't name it yet. But the moment the empath begins to see clearly, when their emotional intelligence kicks in and they stop reacting and start observing, the narcissist's structure begins to wobble, because empaths don't need to confront loudly. They dismantle silently, with a look, with a question, with a refusal to play along. And for the narcissist, who depends entirely on image, that quiet resistance is terrifying. Their illusion only works if everyone around them agrees to believe it. Once someone doesn't, especially someone perceptive, it's as if the stage lights go out. The show stops. And what's left is the truth. The wounded child hiding behind arrogance, behind control, behind manipulation. The narcissist isn't strong, they're scared. Scared of being seen, scared of being rejected. scared of facing a self they've spent a lifetime running from. And the empath? They become the unmovable mirror, reflecting it all back without saying a word. There's something the narcissist doesn't count on, something that doesn't raise its voice or demand attention, but quietly reshapes everything it touches. Emotional intelligence. It's not loud, it's not showy, but it's devastatingly effective. Emotional intelligence means knowing yourself deeply, being aware of what you feel, why you feel it, and how to respond with intention instead of impulse. It's the ability to read a room, sense the shift in someone's energy before they even speak. It's empathy with boundaries, compassion without self-erasure. And that's what sets the emotionally intelligent empath apart. They don't just feel, they understand. They don't just care, they discern. And that's precisely why narcissists fear them. Because the narcissist operates through manipulation. They rely on confusion, on reaction. They push buttons to get a response, to keep control. Their power lies in keeping others off balance, emotionally unstable, constantly guessing. But an emotionally intelligent empath doesn't flinch. They've done the work. They know their triggers, their wounds, their patterns. They don't chase approval because they've started giving it to themselves. They're not trying to be liked, they're trying to be true. And that ruins the narcissist's game. Because the narcissist doesn't know how to function without emotional leverage. If you don't react the way they expect, if you don't collapse when they withdraw, or beg when they blame, you become unreadable, uncontrollable, dangerous. And here's the truth the narcissist will never admit. They are terrified of people who see clearly, because clarity pierces illusion. And emotional intelligence is nothing if not the ability to see things for what they are. Not what you wish they were, not what someone is pretending to be, but the raw, unfiltered truth. The emotionally intelligent empath doesn't need to expose the narcissist. They just need to exist. Their calm observation becomes the one thing the narcissist cannot manipulate. And in that quiet, grounded awareness, the illusion begins to tremble. Because when you can no longer confuse someone, you can no longer control them. And when you can't control them, the mask no longer works. So the empath, once seen as the ideal supply, becomes the ultimate threat. Not because they fight back, but because they don't fall, they see. And that alone is enough to change everything. There's something deeply unsettling about being truly seen, not admired, not adored, not flattered, but seen, naked, without your defenses, without your charm, just you. That's what the empath does to the narcissist. They don't praise the illusion, they reflect what's real, and that reflection, it's not always pretty. Carl Jung spoke of the mirror of the unconscious, the idea that other people reflect back the parts of ourselves we haven't yet faced. And no one does that more piercingly than the emotionally intelligent empath. Because they're not dazzled by the narcissist's performance. They sense the dissonance, the gap between who the narcissist pretends to be and who they really are. And without trying, without accusing, the empath becomes a mirror. A still, clear surface that shows the truth without distortion. At first, the narcissist is drawn to it. That mirror feels like admiration, like connection, like someone who finally gets them. But slowly, they begin to realize the mirror isn't flattering them, it's exposing them. It doesn't reflect the idealized image they've built. It reflects the contradiction, the fear, the emptiness. And that's when the discomfort begins. Because narcissists can handle attention, even obsession, but they can't handle authenticity. They crave validation, not visibility. They want to be adored, not understood. Understanding feels like intrusion, because to be understood is to be known, and being known means being vulnerable. The empath, in their quiet truth, becomes that vulnerability made visible. And that's unbearable. So the narcissist lashes out, pulls away, distorts reality to regain control. But the damage has already begun. The mirror has cracked the illusion. The narcissist starts to feel exposed, anxious, unpredictable. And the more the empath refuses to break character, to react, to doubt themselves, to play the old emotional games, the more the narcissist's foundation shakes. because mirrors don't lie. And the moment someone reflects your shadow instead of your fantasy, you're left with a choice: confront it or run from it. Most narcissists run, but the reflection remains. Long after the empath walks away, the narcissist remembers the one person who saw behind the mask and didn't blink. That memory haunts them, because deep down, beneath the ego and bravado, they know the mirror told the truth, and that truth still lingers, quietly waiting to be faced. It's not what the empath says that unnerves the narcissist, it's what they don't. You see, narcissists thrive on emotional noise. They feed off reactions, the outrage, the tears, the confusion. Every argument, every plea, every defense you give them, it's fuel. It keeps the game alive. It tells them they still have control. But the emotionally intelligent empath doesn't play that game anymore. They've learned that not everything deserves a response. That silence is a form of power. That detachment isn't cold, it's clarity. And when the empath stands in that calm, grounded space, something remarkable happens. The narcissist begins to unravel. Because without chaos, the narcissist loses their stage. Without drama, they have no script. Narcissistic energy needs resistance. It needs emotional turbulence to feel alive, to maintain its illusion of dominance. But the empath, when truly awakened, offers no resistance. They simply observe. They remain present, but they do not submit. And that presence alone, without begging, without defending, without breaking, becomes a silent challenge the narcissist is unequipped to handle. They try to provoke an oathing. They bait stillness. They withdraw Loveno chase. Suddenly, the tactics that once guaranteed power fall flat, because the empath is no longer reacting from a wound, they're responding from wisdom. And in that shift, the narcissist senses something terrifying. They've lost their grip, not because the empath became cruel or confrontational, but because they became sovereign. Carl Jung once said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And this is exactly what the narcissist feels when their attempts to provoke are met with peace. The empath's refusal to engage becomes unbearable because it forces the narcissist to confront the silence they've been running from, the emptiness behind the performance. It's not just unsettling, it's destabilizing. Because chaos was their cover, and now there's nowhere to hide. The empath becomes a mirror and a wall, all at once reflecting truth while refusing to collapse. And in that stillness, the narcissist hears the one thing they've spent their life avoiding, their own emptiness echoing back at them. That's the real challenge. Not the empath's words, but their refusal to be conquered. Not submission, but presence. Not resistance, but peace. And to the narcissist, peace is the loudest silence of all. The narcissist's entire world is built on control of perception, emotion, narrative. They twist facts, rewrite memories, blur the lines between truth and distortion. Why? Because the truth as it is doesn't serve them. It exposes too much. It shows the cracks. And so, they control the story. Who's to blame? Who's the victim? Who needs to apologize? But the emotionally intelligent empath doesn't need the story. They feel what's beneath it. They sense the tension behind the words, the pain behind the anger, the contradiction behind the charm. They don't get lost in the plot, they read the energy. And that's what makes them so dangerous to a narcissist. Because while narcissists manipulate the external, empaths navigate the internal. The narcissist needs to dominate the surface, but the empath feels into the undercurrent. One needs to talk louder, the other listens deeper, and that shift in awareness changes everything. Carl Jung's concept of projection explains this perfectly. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The narcissist, however, avoids that understanding at all costs. Instead of owning their shame, their fears, their inadequacies, they project them onto others. You're the selfish one, you're too sensitive, you're the problem. But the empath, when emotionally intelligent, doesn't absorb those projections, they recognize them. They don't internalize the blame, they decode it, and by doing so, they break the pattern. Suddenly, the narcissist's favorite weapons, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, triangulation, stop working because the empath sees through them, and when manipulation fails, desperation follows. The narcissist may double down. They may try harder to regain control, but it's already too late. Because once the empath sees the game, they can't unsee it. They don't need to win the argument. They don't even need the narcissist to admit the truth. They already know it. And that knowing disarms the narcissist in a way nothing else can. Because truth is the one force a narcissist can't spin once it's been seen for what it is. So the empath stops engaging, not out of weakness, but because they've outgrown the lie. They've stepped out of the script. And without control of the narrative, the narcissist fads not in volume, but in relevance. What used to define the empath now becomes a footnote in their growth. Because once you learn to read energy, the story loses power. And when the story loses power, so does the one who tried to write it for you. If there's one thing that unnerves a narcissist more than being ignored, it's being told no. Not with rage, not with drama, but with calm, unwavering certainty. Because to a narcissist, boundaries aren't just inconvenient, they're a threat. A clear, healthy boundary is a mirror they can't distort. It's a line they can't cross. And for someone who survives on intrusion, control, and enmeshment, that kind of clarity is terrifying. You see, narcissists don't relate, they invade. They probe your insecurities, test your limits, and slowly mold your identity around their needs. They don't ask where you end and they begin, they just assume there are no lines at all. But the emotionally intelligent empath aware starts drawing those lines, not with anger, but with self-respect. Not as a punishment, but as protection. And that alone changes the entire dynamic. Because boundaries say something narcissists can't handle, you don't get to define me anymore. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, distinct from all masks, roles, and projections. And boundaries are the physical, emotional, and energetic expression of that individuation. They say, this is me, this is what I will accept, and this is what I won't. Narcissists depend on blurred lines. They rely on guilt to make you say yes, on confusion to keep you quiet. But a boundary backed by self-awareness cuts through all of it. It doesn't ask for approval, it doesn't explain itself, it just is. And that is revolutionary. Because when you stop bending to accommodate someone else's chaos, you reclaim yourself, not just your peace, but your identity. The narcissist may call it selfish, dramatic, even cruel. But don't be fooled. What they're really saying is, I can't control you anymore. And they're right. Because once the empath chooses clarity over chaos, distance over drama, and truth over trauma, the game is over. Not in a sudden explosion, but in a quiet exhale. A firm, gentle, non-negotiable no. A door that closes without slamming. A presence that stays centered even as everything else tries to provoke it. That is what a boundary truly is, not a wall, but a declaration. And once declared, the narcissist is left outside with only their illusion to keep them company. There's a moment. It doesn't always come with thunder or fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in a tired sigh, a quiet tear, a morning where the weight finally becomes too heavy. And in that moment, something shifts. The empath wakes up. For so long, they've carried the burden of the relationship. They've tried harder, given more, apologized for things they didn't do. They've made themselves smaller just to keep the peace. And every time something felt off, they turned inward. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe if I explain one more time, they'll finally see me. But the narcissist never does, because they were never listening to understand, only to control. And then, it clicks. Not suddenly, but deeply. This isn't love, it's control. It lands not in the mind, but in the gut. A knowing that can't be shaken. The empath finally sees that love shouldn't feel like walking on eggshells. That intimacy shouldn't require self-erasure. That being in a relationship shouldn't mean being in a constant state of anxiety. And with that realization, the narcissist's spell begins to break. The questions stop. The justifications stop. The chasing stops. Because now the empath knows this was never mutuality, was manipulation dressed as connection. And here's what terrifies the narcissist the most. The empath no longer needs to explain themselves. Because when you know something deeply, you don't argue it, you live it. The empath begins to reclaim their time, their voice, their body, their energy. They stop apologizing for needing space. They stop reacting to guilt trips. They stop asking for validation from someone who's incapable of giving it. And in that stillness, the narcissist begins to panic. Because without the empath's confusion, the illusion can't hold. The control slips, the narrative crumbles, the power dissolves. This is the true turning point, not when the empath fights back, but when they stop playing entirely, when they realize that no explanation is required to leave what harms you, when they understand that walking away doesn't mean failure, it means freedom. Carl Jung said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." And once the empath does, once they choose themselves with action, not theory, the narcissist watches the one thing they never thought would happen. The empath, once their emotional supply, becomes untouchable. Not because they built walls, but because they found their center. And from that place, they don't beg, they don't prove. They simply walk away. And they never look back. When the empath walks away not in anger, but in clarity, the narcissist feels it like an earthquake. Not because of the loss of love, but because of the loss of control. The illusion they've worked so hard to maintain, the grand performance, the flawless mask starts to crack. And without the empath there to mirror admiration, to absorb projection, to carry the emotional burden, the narcissist's fantasy begins to implode. Internally, it's chaos. Panic, because the one person who played their role so perfectly is no longer participating. Rage, because their power is slipping and they can't control the narrative. Silent treatment, not as distance, but as punishment. Gaslighting, twisted more desperately than ever. You're abandoning me. You've changed. You're not the person I thought you were. But the real message underneath all of it is simpler and more brutal. You're no longer feeding my illusion. And for the narcissist, that's intolerable. Carl Jung taught us that what we refuse to face within ourselves becomes part of the shadow, pushed down, hidden, denied. But it doesn't disappear, it festers. And when the empath exits, they take with them the emotional scaffolding that kept the narcissist's shadow out of view. Suddenly, that shadow comes rushing forward. All the shame, all the inadequacy, all the self-hatred they buried beneath charm and control is now standing in the open with no one left to absorb it. So they project, they cast blame. They twist stories, because facing the truth that they were never whole, that the love was a mirror and not a reality, would mean dismantling everything they believe about themselves. And that's not something most narcissists are willing or even able to do. So instead, they act out, they lash out, they search for a new supply. But the echo of the empath remains. Because deep down, the narcissist knows they were seen. Not the version they curated, but the truth beneath it. And being seen then left not with hatred, but with peace, is the most unbearable thing of all. Because now the illusion doesn't just collapse, it haunts. Revenge is for the wounded who still want to be heard, still want to be validated, still believe that if they scream loud enough, the person who broke them will finally say sorry. But the emotionally intelligent empath has moved beyond that. They don't want revenge, they want peace, and that, paradoxically, is what devastates the narcissist most. Because the narcissist is expecting drama, they're counting on it. Rage keeps the story alive. Retaliation means relevance. As long as the empath is still emotionally entangled, there's still a game to play. But when the empath truly detaches, it's like a curtain drops. No parting monologue, no fight, just space, stillness, nothing left to feed the illusion. That's the wound the narcissist can't recover from: not being hated, but being ignored, not being punished, but being seen and released. Because in that moment, the empath is no longer orbiting around the narcissist's pain, they're centered in their own healing. And that healing doesn't require the narcissist's downfall, it just requires their absence. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And this is the very path the empath has chosen to make conscious what was hidden, to wake up from the trance, to stop confusing intensity with intimacy, chaos with connection. That awakening is its own closure. That detachment is its own justice. Because now the empath doesn't need an apology. They don't need revenge. They don't even need acknowledgement. They've reclaimed their energy, their voice, their self-worth, and with that, they've taken back the one thing the narcissist tried so hard to control, their reality. The narcissist may spiral. They may smear. They may try to rewrite the past to save face. But it doesn't matter. The empath has exited the story, not with bitterness, but with sovereignty. And that kind of exit? That quiet, complete, unapologetic walking away, it echoes louder than any revenge ever could. Because the greatest consequence for someone addicted to control is realizing they no longer have any. Not all pain destroys, some pain refines, and for the emotionally intelligent empath, suffering doesn't become a permanent wound, it becomes a catalyst. The tears, the heartbreak, the confusion, they don't just leave scars, they leave maps. And over time, the empath learns to read them. Because what once broke them now teaches them. What once silenced them now speaks through them. This is emotional alchemy, sacred process of turning wounds into wisdom. While the narcissist repeats the same cycle, clinging to a fragile illusion, the empath transforms, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole, of integrating shadow and light, of returning to the truth of who you are. It's not easy. It requires descent. The empath must face the part of themselves that allowed the pain, that tolerated the mistreatment, that confused manipulation with love. But instead of turning away, they turn inward. They look at the patterns, the beliefs, the buried fears. They ask the hard questions: why did I stay? What was I hoping to fix? Where did I abandon myself to be accepted? And in doing so, they begin to reclaim their power bit by bit, breath by breath. The pain becomes a teacher, the silence becomes a sanctuary. And slowly the empath rises not as who they were, but as who they were meant to become. Meanwhile, the narcissist stays stuck in a loop, repeating the same relationships, telling the same stories, wearing the same mask, hoping someone new will believe it. But the difference is this: the empath doesn't need anyone to believe in them anymore, because they believe in themselves. They've walked through the fire and come out with their soul intact. They've stopped looking for saviors and started becoming their own. And that shift, it's irreversible. Because once you transmute pain into purpose, once you turn betrayal into self-respect, there's no going back. You no longer chase healing, you embody it. And while the narcissist runs from their shadow, the empath integrates theirs. That's why they grow. That's why they evolve. The narcissist hides behind image. The empath stands in truth. And in that truth, they become untouchable, not because they're guarded, but because they're whole. There's a reason the narcissist performs. A reason they rehearse charm, exaggerate kindness, curate their every move. It's not just for approval, it's to stay hidden. Because to be truly seen, not admired, but seen, is their greatest fear. Behind the mask is a self they've spent a lifetime avoiding, not because it's evil, but because it's raw, vulnerable, unformed. To be seen without filters means exposure. It means having nowhere left to hide. And that's unbearable, because deep down, the narcissist doesn't believe they're lovable as they are. They believe love must be earned, manipulated, controlled. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But the narcissist refuses that privilege. They trade authenticity for performance, depth for illusion, connection for control. They run from the very thing the empath embraces: inner work. While the empath turns inward through journaling, therapy, reflection, solitude, the narcissist turns outward. They project, they distract, they perform. Because if they slow down long enough to feel, the facade starts to tremble. If they stop controlling the image, the shadow creeps in. And that shadow is full of all the things they can't accept: inadequacy, shame, fear of abandonment. So they keep performing, hoping someone else will validate the mask so they don't have to face what's beneath it. But the empath, they do the opposite. They sit in their silence, they face their shadow. They cry the tears that needed crying years ago. And in doing so, they become rooted not in perfection, but in presence. That presence becomes the very thing the narcissist can't tolerate. Because when someone is whole within themselves, they don't fall for the show. They see through it. And when they see through it, the narcissist is left exposed, not by confrontation, but by contrast. By standing next to someone real, their falseness becomes obvious. And that is what shakes them to the core. Not because the empath is attacking, but because the empath exists as proof that healing is possible. That self-love doesn't need applause. That wholeness doesn't perform, it simply is. And to someone who has spent their life hiding from themselves, there is nothing more threatening than someone who is no longer afraid to be seen. There's a silence that screams freedom, a distance that isn't punishment but protection. No contact is not about cruelty or revenge. It's about reclaiming your peace. For the emotionally intelligent empath, going no contact isn't a weapon, it's a boundary steeped in wisdom. It's saying, I choose myself now, and that means choosing silence over chaos. Because silence has power, stillness has clarity. And in a relationship built on confusion, gaslighting, and emotional volatility, silence becomes sacred. It becomes healing. The narcissist, however, sees no contact as betrayal, as abandonment, as rejection, but only because they mistake access for love. For them, connection was never about mutual care, it was about control. And now, they've lost their supply. The attention, the emotional reactions, the energy they fed on, it's gone. And that absence becomes unbearable. Not because they miss the person, but because they miss the control. Meanwhile, for the empath, silence isn't emptiness. It's a return to self, to sanity, to soul. It's the space where old wounds begin to breathe, where questions turn into answers, where fog lifts and the inner voice finally speaks without being shouted over. Carl Jung wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." And that is what the empath begins to do in no contact. They awaken. They begin to feel what's theirs, separate from the projections. They begin to differentiate their guilt from the narcissist's blame, their sadness from someone else's chaos. And in that inner separation, they gain strength. The narcissist may try to bait them back with sweetness, with guilt, with manufactured crisis. But the empath now knows, connection without respect is not love. Presence without peace is not loyalty. They don't need to answer every message. They don't need to justify their silence. Because silence is the answer. No contact is not a wall, it's a doorway. And it leads to clarity, sovereignty, and a life no longer dictated by someone else's wounds. The narcissist loses access. The empath regains alignment. And in that quiet space, healing begins not in noise, but in stillness. Not in conflict, but in calm. And that calm is where power lives now. Beneath the stories, beneath the survival strategies and adult personas, are two children, one who learned to feel too much and one who learned to feel nothing at all. The empath and the narcissist are not born enemies. They are born from similar wounds. But they choose different paths. Carl Jung believed that our unlived lives, the parts of us we suppress, deny, or abandon, become our shadow. And both the empath and the narcissist carry shadows rooted in childhood pain, abandonment, neglect, emotional inconsistency. The empath responded by turning inward. They became hyper-attuned to the needs of others, hoping that if they could just love hard enough, they'd be safe. They became the fixers, the feelers, the quiet givers. The narcissist responded by building armor. They buried their vulnerability beneath control, image, and dominance. They decided early, I won't be hurt again. I'll be the one who hurts first. Both were wounded, but only one chose to heal. The empath, at some point, realizes that caretaking isn't love, that self-abandonment doesn't earn safety. And in that realization, they begin the work. They turn toward the inner child, not to silence it, but to listen, to validate the unmet needs, to grieve, to reparent, and in doing so they stop repeating the past. The narcissist, on the other hand, runs from feeling, from memory, from shame. They exile the wounded child and build a persona in its place. But that child doesn't go away. It acts out through projection, manipulation, entitlement. And the narcissist keeps reenacting the same story: hurt or be hurt, win or lose, control or disappear. That's the real divide. Not empathy versus ego, but growth versus repetition. The empath evolves, the narcissist circles. And the more the empath heals, the more the contrast becomes unbearable for the narcissist, because now they're standing next to someone who chose the path they refused to walk. And that choice, not the pain, not the past, but the choices, what separates them. Because healing is never easy. It requires looking inward when it's easier to blame. It requires feeling when numbing would be faster. But the empath does it anyway, and in doing so, they break the cycle not just for themselves, but for everyone who came before them. That is the quiet legacy of the healing empath. Not perfection, but transformation. Not avoidance, but integration. And that courage, to sit with the child they once were and finally say, "You're safe now," is what makes them truly powerful. It was never rage that dismantled the narcissist. Not confrontation, not revenge, not shouting matches or exposed truths. What undid them slowly, silently, irreversibly was emotional intelligence. The empath's calm clarity. Their quiet refusal to participate in the performance. The shift from questioning to knowing. From absorbing pain to releasing it. From explaining to simply walking away. That is what shattered the illusion, because narcissistic control thrives on chaos, on confusion, on keeping others reactive and off balance. But emotional intelligence is steady, it's grounded. It doesn't chase or collapse, it observes. It doesn't fight to be understood, it simply understands itself. And that self-understanding is the one thing the narcissist cannot manipulate. Throughout this journey, the empath has been told they're too much, too emotional, too soft. But the truth is, they were never weak. They were deep, deep feelers, deep listeners, deep processors. And it is that depth once protected and reclaimed that becomes untouchable. The empath's path is not one of avoidance or escape. It is one of awareness, of integration, of becoming whole. While the narcissist runs from the self, the empath returns to it. While the narcissist projects the shadow, the empath integrates it. And in that integration, the dynamic breaks. The control dissolves. The illusion dies. Because the narcissist cannot exist without someone believing the act. And the moment the empath stops feeding the fantasy, stops reacting, fixing, apologizing, justifying, the narcissist is left with the one thing they've avoided all along: themselves. Raw, unmasked. Alone with the very emptiness they've tried to fill with power. That's the real collapse, not of the relationship, but of the illusion. And it ends not with a scream, but with a whisper, a moment of clarity. A line drawn in quiet strength. A final goodbye that doesn't beg to be answered. Because the empath doesn't need closure anymore, they've become it. Carl Jung taught that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. And the narcissist, in resisting truth, only fed their own undoing. The empath, in facing truth, found freedom. So, here we are. The illusion is broken. The empath stands scarred but whole, not because they fought harder, but because they chose wiser. They saw through the act. They stepped out of the cycle. And they did the one thing the narcissist never thought they would do. They stopped playing the role. And in that moment, reality arrived. Quiet, unflinching, inevitable. And with it, the power returned to where it always belonged. Not in control, but in truth. Not in domination, but in self-respect. Not in feeding the illusion, but in choosing to finally, completely live without it. This story was intense. But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.